Today, I've got the pleasure again of having John Pang as my guest. And the reason for that is that John and I, only a week ago, in the second half of June, were together in Budapest, Hungary, attending the Budapest Global Dialogue, both as participants and also as panelists. And I thought that it might be a nice opportunity, having had a little bit of time to reflect upon the days that we spent there, to maybe bring some thoughts together about the conference and what some prospective ambitions and outcomes might be from it, as well as, of course, reflect on some of our learnings, having been, in the heart of Europe, so to speak. So welcome to the show, John.
Thank you. It's great to be back here with you again.
Look, we spent 3 days in Budapest at the Budapest Global Dialogue. It was an event that had about 120 speakers all up, and probably in the order of 400 delegates from around the world, mainly from Central and Western Europe, but there were representatives from Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and of course, Australia. John, if I could ask you, what were your sort of high-level impressions of the event, and what were the elements that that you took away from it as a first blush reaction?
In the first instance, I found it very interesting that we were invited to this, that we were invited at all to this event, and it became clear very quickly the platform that the organizers were trying to create, right? Namely, the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. I think they really are trying to create a kind of East-West dialogue, and but the framing of the dialogue was going to be different and new, in that it was the Hungarian administration, or the Hungarian values of sovereignty, of state sovereignty, and a sort of family first approach. I think these values underlay these values were being conveyed through this, but these values were also very useful for creating a kind of frame for us to dialogue on certain issues. I spoke. I ran a pod there, but I also spoke at the event, and basically one might describe it as a kind of post-liberal framing that might open up discussion in ways that you don't otherwise hear. So in that way, I think really, really interesting.
This question of post-liberalism seems to be quite central in a philosophical sense to grasping the sort of direction of thinking that is emerging from Hungary as a reaction in part to its own history, but also as a way of perhaps transcending what it sees as the limitations of the European Union story as it has been to date, and mapping out something of a roadmap for an alternative European story that is perhaps a little bit less European, or if I could put it a different way, a little bit less contemporary European, and
Yes.
arguably a little bit more old world European. And you had some discussions, I know, with some colleagues about this question of liberalism and post-liberalism, and I think people would be actually fascinated by what these ideas are trying to get at, and where do you think it's all possibly heading?
Yes. All dialogue occurs in some sort of framework, and against a set of basic assumptions about what can be discussed and what not, what matters, what factors can be brought into consideration. And in that sense, then a post-liberal framing is different and refreshing and useful. Just taking it down to the level of East, even for East-West dialogue, what they clearly tried to, what the organizers clearly tried to do was have a platform in which the European attitude towards the Asia, towards let us say Southeast Asia or East Asia or China, would not necessarily be from a EU, what they might call a globalist perspective. So I agree with you. There's a very clear sense in which this is not the EU prescribed, heavily ideologized perspective on the world. From that perspective, you would miss the very, very different ways in which other people, people from other civilizations, other regions, view the world. So, we're all familiar with the types of dialogue, for example, you might have at the World Economic Forum or something like that, in which a very a kind of dominant neoliberal liberal framework is in place, and it's unquestioned. And Asian views or African views get translated into that very, very quickly. The Asian and African elites that you invite to these places are the ones, precisely the ones who are most adept at presenting their home regions, their native countries in those terms, translating it in those terms, so to speak. But I think those translations are suspect. They are, in a way, they are re-enrolling that background, that culture, that even that political perspective into an acceptable liberal framework. Therefore, I think this type of post-liberal, classical European, or you might say old world framing is actually a much better basis, I would argue, for engaging with views that are really very different, materially different, and importantly different at this time. It's the perspective precisely that one needs for a multipolar world. Because if there is a multipolar world, you are going to have multipolar perspectives on the world. You are going to have to deal with different cultures, different histories, different epistemologies. And those are not reducible to simply a liberal perspective. So it feels less dogmatic to me. It felt,
correct me if I'm
that way.
wrong then, John. One of the dimensions or one of the aspects of what is being counted as a liberal view or a liberal framing is that it also tends to have a powerfully universalizing ontology.
Yes.
As well as a universalizing normative framework of what is right, what is wrong, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, what is barbaric, what is civilized.
Yes.
And a post-liberal articulation or a post-liberal ontology seeks to recover a greater sense of difference rather than try to force people into a single box.
Yes.
Would that be a fair characterization of at least one of the dimensions of this liberal post-liberal question?
Yes, indeed. And the Hungarian perspective is post-liberal in a very particular way, in precisely a classical Western, classical European way. It's not post-liberal in pretending to be, avant-garde, right, or progressivist, or beyond. It's something beyond a traditional set of values. In fact, it asserts a traditional worldview. And paradoxically, you might expect, right, that this is in the liberal frame. This is portrayed as right wing, as conservative, right, as intolerant. But in fact, this is actually the perspective that is more friendly to, more at home with difference, I would argue, because precisely it does not impose a premature, an unjustified, and an excessive type of universalism across the world, across other cultures. And at the same time, I think it sticks to certain things, certain what in the Western tradition is called are called natural law, or uh, a common sense worldview that others actually share. So we do actually have things in common beyond just that we can have dialogue over. Otherwise, it would just be Babel, right? Uh, so there's that paradox, and there's an apparent paradox, and I think that's a much more promising way. I that's my own position, I must say, that a dialogue between a classical Western perspective and, say, the Chinese perspective is much more fruitful than any attempt to enact something like that, to have a dialogue in a liberal framework.
I wanted to pick up on a couple of threads here. Um, the idea of this return to classicism seems to me also to have been part of a reaction to a sense of social anomie and nihilism that has become a defining characteristic of liberal modernity. And this Hungarian turn, so to speak, going back to a certain reading of Hegel, for example, seeks to overcome the nihilism of liberal modernity to find something richer in the human condition. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that this turn to a particular reading of Hegel interestingly opens up a, a portal to a dialogue with the Asiatic or Chinese philosophical traditions by virtue of a range of similarities, if you will, between some elements within Hegel's ontology and a Chinese ontology. Thoughts?
That's one way to do it. I haven't actually conducted one on Hegelian lines. The type of civilizational dialogue, East-West dialogue, that I have tried to conduct or to enact, to make happen, is between the classical Western tradition, in other words, pre-Hegel,
Yeah.
and the Chinese tradition, where both clearly share. There is so much apparently in common in terms of its conceptions of the human good, in having substantive conceptions of society, and of society's claims on human beings, and on virtue, on the on the fulfillment of human life within society, within family, and so on. These are things that are shared in the classical Western tradition. So, when Europeans and Chinese speak to one another in that way, they have a lot in common. So in that way, I think the Hungarian thing, if it's a turn, whether you're using Hegel, or if you're, or as I might advocate, going further back to a classical European tradition that is both, in Hungary's case and in the case of Europe for 1500 years, is both Hellenic, Roman, and also Catholic, in a seamless tradition. So that tradition has actually interacted, as we know, there's historical precedence for its interaction with Chinese thought from the 16th century, 17th, in the 16th and 17th centuries, through the Jesuit mission in China, for example, right? There was an extraordinary dialogue by the Jesuits with Chinese thought, in which they identified enough of a set of commonalities to make for the Chinese world to be legible to them and to be translatable into their world in terms of natural law, for example, right? What a beneficent ruler, what should be. Even political ideas were translated, and these were, of course, very, very influential on Europe, on the European Enlightenment subsequently. So there was almost 200 years of that sort of interaction, and we've never had anything like that since. If you look at the way in which Chinese thought is regarded now in today's liberal framework, which is a kind of far more how to say this, a more hardline, late liberal sort of approach. It might seem to have little to recommend it. There is only one way, right? This sort of post 1991 end of history worldview in which everything else must be reduced to the fundamental liberation of the individual from all constraint, all every obligation that is not consented to, for example. So this really matters. Being able to set up this sort of dialogue in which the difference of the other culture is observed. It doesn't mean that people have to agree with one another, but you don't sort of flatten out the whole perspective and expect everyone to be, to live in this one world that you created.
One of the interesting things that I sort of picked up in the days that we were there is how these sort of deep ideas, these very philosophical and conceptual ideas, then played out in very concrete terms. You touched on the issue of the family, and of course we
Yes.
know in Hungary there's been a strong natalist turn
Yes.
towards promoting families and increasing birth rates. But the other one is one of the key themes of the conference was this idea of national sovereignty, and of course the Hungarian experience seems to be quite an interesting one and can tell us quite a lot about what some of the issues are. One is, of course, its own unique history, and the other one is how itself has become part of a broader project, the European Union project, which clearly has given rise to, particularly in recent times, some considerable amount of friction. And I noticed that when we spoke with particularly some of the participants from Western Europe proper, there was clearly some deep fissures between the liberal view, which dominates still in the Western European polity, and where the Hungarian folk are trying to carve out a position.
Yes, indeed. And I think it's quite topical, right? They're being censured or punished now, penalized by the European Union for their stand on LGBTQ issues, for example, right? And on their own position, their natalist, pro-family position, they disagree with that ideology, and they don't seem to have. Well, they want to assert something more, and they can't seem to assert that in EU terms. It's important to remember how suddenly this has all come about. 20 or 30 years ago, you could have asserted a position such as Viktor Orban's without being considered a right-wing extremist. But here we are. So the rest of the world hasn't gone through that revolution in social mores. The rest of the world doesn't undergo this constant pressure to dissolve every basic human and natural characteristic, natural identity or natural affiliation, chief among which is the family. So I think if they want to, they put it in terms of the family, they put it in terms of sovereignty, of there being an actual Hungarian community. That's their project. It's extremely legible to people from other parts of the world, because Chinese people, for example, do believe that there is a, that family matters, that the nation is more than just the aggregate of the individuals in it, that its history matters, that, from individual, that the social roles, uh, father, as Confucius might have it, father and son, teacher and student, these are the ways through which human beings realize themselves, then that a good society provides ways for people to do that. Again, if I look at this from an Aristotelian, a classical Western perspective, that's entirely, legible. It makes entire sense. The way I would put it is, there is a substantive notion of the common good that the Hungarians are trying to recover and turn into policy and national policy. And that's an excellent basis for engaging with people from, say, Southeast Asia or from China.
I guess that's my sense also, that it was a reaction to this sense of nihilism in
Yeah.
liberal modernity, that that this notion of common good in effect had disappeared, and the work to recover it, to redefine it, to figure out what something called the common good might actually be,
Yes.
is actually the first stepping stone that needs to
Yes.
be engaged in. The other thing that I sort of thought was interesting, again in this sort of wider context, is this question of Russia, right? I mean, you can't go to a geopolitics, sovereignty, geoeconomics conference in Europe without the question of Russia somehow being there, and you could feel the tension often in the rooms, that this the Russian question, or the Russia question, is the lodestone that prohibits the movement forward, for Europe writ large, but also for the resolution of this set of questions between a Western European liberal modern sensibility and this emerging Hungarian Central European classical European sensibility.
Yes.
What was your take on the Russia question, having been there and sort of bumped into people and talked to all sorts of people
That was
about
really
this issue?
interesting. That was really, and it was really interesting to see the contrasts, and to hear the views from, European colleagues on Russia. Of course, the organizers were careful to invite people from across the spectrum of views on. They didn't just invite fellow travelers, right? In this, fellow new right or populist travelers, if you will, Europeans who were only ideologically aligned with them.
Mm.
They invited liberals and
Yeah.
they invited Germans. So uh, and you could see the tremendous contrast in views on Russia. The Hungarians, of all people, would know about Russians, and about a Russia threat, not to underestimate a security threat from Russia. And yet there is nothing like the panic and the, um, almost the visceral, and truly irrational hatred of Russia, um, because and that's where liberalism is really strange. I think one reason Russia is so easily othered, demonized, is precisely because it too has uh, is a state that uh, prioritizes exactly these same things. Since 1991, it has gone through a tumultuous period, but there has been the recovery of religion, of traditional Russian culture. It is a state with deeply Russian characteristics. and a connection to Russian civilization. Now, that civilization, culture, tradition matter to Russia just as they do to Hungary. And now you see how they are, of course, legible to one another, apart from the fact that this is a shared, there's a lot of it that is shared across an Orthodox and Catholic, Western, Eastern, and Western divide. Um, but still, Russia was and is a European country. So what it was to me a far saner approach to Russia, a far more objective approach. I heard on the other side these views that frankly are amazing, that Russia is going to, go after us, European countries, one after another, that Putin is bent on invading Poland next, or the Baltics next, and after that it will be Germany. So these are not serious, to me, and to people, I think to a lot of people outside of North Atlantic Europe, they just don't seem to have any evidence behind it. And I don't see that fear among the Hungarians. And again, that puts them and us, speaking as an Asian person, in the same space. We feel like, hey, we're talking to people with the same common sense. Because certainly
this
across the European divide, there is a different common sense. If one were to engage with the standard pro-EU, pro-NATO view, I find it very difficult to communicate. I think we did our best. We just listened. One can only listen.
Well, we had some long conversations
Yes.
over breakfast with
Yes,
as well.
indeed.
Yeah. I must say I was remarkably patient, even if I do say so myself.
You were.
You
were amazingly patient. But I also noticed that we could do nothing more than listen. Because if we were to put any view out, it would be totally unacceptable, and we would be bad people for holding those views. Now, that kind of heavily sort of moralized, view of the world, and you have that heavily moralized view of the world, and yet you think that the Hungarians or the Chinese are the ones who are, right-wing traditionalists or whatnot. That I find really interesting.
I wanted to drill in on this issue of the paranoia and fear. Politics in large part is the mobilization of energy, and to be able to harness energy and channel it and keep it together. And a great way of doing that, of course, is through the emotions of fear and hate and paranoia. Asia itself, of course, is a very diverse part of the world, with an incredibly rich history of interactions and at times conflict, but often exchange between a diverse set of cultures and civilizations. And this question of fear seems to be, and maybe I have it wrong, right? But I got the sense after this conference and being immersed in this milieu for a few days that there is a much deeper sense of fear, hard to explain, but a deep sense of fear in the European context than there is in the Asian context. And I think of, small countries, of which there are many in Asia, and living in the shadow, so to speak, of one of the biggest countries in the world. And in fact, arguably living in the middle of the two biggest countries in the world, India on the west and China to the northeast. And yet I don't ever sense amongst the countries of Asia the same level of fear and paranoia that I sensed from our Western European friends whenever Russia came up in conversation. Did you get that sense as well?
Absolutely. I think they've built Russia up into something that can only be that has to be described in anthropological and religious dimensions. It's just not something you can explain looking at Russia's objective record, its behavior, and at any of the statements that they're making. There's just no evidence that they want to, reconstitute the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, um, or invade Western Europe. I mean, this is absurd, quite frankly. And we can say this to one another, but you can't say this to an EU type European.
Well, not in polite company anyway.
Without things descending into. So,
which
but
I
you
guess
can
John
speak to
leads
Hungarians, right? And the Hungarians say that about us as well. We say, okay, we're among people of, wow, relief. We can talk with common sense. Now, common sense is one way of describing this ability to speak with one another. It's very inadequate and very general, but yes, there's a common sense world, and there is the world is viewed through this very, very high temperature liberal perspective.
So what I found interesting too is that Hungary is a small population, landlocked, and obviously adjacent to some very, very large places and not far off from Russia itself. It's got its own history with the Soviet Union. And yet, as a country of, around 10 million people, it doesn't seem to harbour that sense of fear and paranoia vis-a-vis Russia that we have seen not only in our own experiences in the discussions that we had with our European friends, but in what we've seen this week, which is the week when NATO held its annual conference, right? And we saw in the 2 days of the NATO event this incredible, certainly from my perspective, I sensed an incredible amount of fear and loathing. Put aside for now the relationship emotionally and psychologically between the Western European elite leadership and Washington. But the other one that I thought was kind of a bit odd was this sense that we're in a position to defend the safety and security of 1 billion people. And yet representing 1 billion people was a group of people who seem to be driven by fear. And yet you have a small place like Hungary representing a people of 10 million that didn't have that fear. And I reflect on the Asian experience again, which is a whole bunch of relatively small countries in Asia from, 30 million through to 90 million, 40, 50, 26 million or whatever, in close proximity to 1.4 billion. And yet there isn't the fear.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm really struggling to understand how an elite establishment that claims to speak on behalf of 1 billion people can have as a starting point such a low sense of self-regard about themselves, as the basis upon which they relate to others.
Absolutely.
Am I missing something here? Did I not pick something up, in those days in Budapest? What's your take on this?
This is a really important thing to note. This is an important puzzle phenomenon. Look, in this recent NATO meeting, NATO, I think, spends about 55% of the world's arms expenditure, accounts for about 55%. And yet that's not enough for them. And yet they are threatened and they want to spend more. This meeting was not even about Ukraine. This meeting was about upping everyone's military budget to 5% of GDP. So, look, I have my own views of this, but they have to do with precisely that philosophical framework and that cultural framework. And it begins with what I call a kind of ontology of violence. It's a Hobbesian perspective on society. And here we talk about Hobbes as almost a progenitor of one of the fathers of liberalism, with this view of uh, the state of nature or of
It's a
anarchy,
jungle out there.
the
It's a jungle
the
out there.
original state, what we are at root and originally are, uh, these beasts that live lives nasty, brutish, and short, because for the sake caught in a logic in which to ensure our own security, we must threaten, we necessarily threaten others, and there's this escalation of threat and counter threat, resulting inevitably in the violence of all against all. You project that outwards into international relations, and here we had the opportunity, you and I, to interact with John Mearsheimer, right? And I asked him, John, is your view inductive, your realism, your view that we are caught in this tragedy, as he notes, of a kind of violence between states, necessarily violence between states, because the international order is anarchic, and therefore that each state needs to maximize its security, and as it does so, it threatens others, and that the only way to be maximally secure is to be the hegemon, right? So that I asked him, is that sort of empirical? Is that inductive, or is it deductive? Does it come from a certain prior set of axioms, right? Of assumptions, original assumptions about the nature of society, of society, of human beings? Is it Hobbes? I said, and he said yes. Okay, Mearsheimer is, if nothing else, honest, intellectually honest. So it's a Hobbesian view, and on that Hobbesian view, if you're not armed up, you will be engulfed by the other. You are in some sort of necessary struggle, and sure, of course, there is that logic. My perspective is, of course, the world runs on these realist principles because that's the world you realists made. Starting about 400 years ago, or to be precise, maybe 377 or something, from the Treaty of Westphalia, you created these things called nation states, right? And that's your European thing. And you have 300 or 400 years of endless war, incessant war with one another, which you then exported to the rest of the world, and you created the world in your image. We are now in a world of nation states. Okay, fine. But this has not always been the only way of organizing interstate political relations. And other people have historical memories of other ways of organizing things. China, for example, is it's an enormous treasure vault of historical experience, of political experience, right? You want warring states? We've had warring states. And but that's past. We learned the lessons from that, more than 2,200 years ago. And nobody wants to go back to that. But Europe is in this perpetual sort of warring states condition. And it's become cultural. So my own perspective, which is very particular to me, I guess, and one might argue, people of course can disagree with me, but I see that ontology, your basic ontology, in that, you are originally these asocial, these terrified creatures fighting one another. That's that's a thought experiment. That's at best a kind of idealization, in a sort of conceptual fiction, right? Human beings, if you want to look at it empirically, are social creatures. Now, you want to model things like that, and then you actually believe the world is like that, and now you live in this state of terror. Of course, there are many other factors. Of course, one can talk about the arms industry and its need to keep on going, but I think there really is something cultural. There is something civilizational, because as you point out, Warwick, I think that type of fear, that constant fear, which is the flip side of the making of war. Fear and violence, fear and aggression are just flip sides of each other.
So if
That
we
looks
then
really
push back,
European from a global perspective. Look at Cambodia next to China. Look at Laos. Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. I mean, if people there lived on a European index of fear, nobody would sleep at night, right?
So
So,
if we sort of grapple with this, and perhaps this is our last little stanza for this discussion, because it can go, it can go deep into the night or day, depending on where you are. Um, as Hungary itself seeks to rethink this post-liberal direction through the lenses of the classics, in a sense, it's trying to go past Hobbes again to arrive at a different foundational understanding of what it is to be human. And if you can arrive at a different foundational understanding of that question, then you might have the hopes of building the social institutions that support an environment that is not nihilistic and that is not reduced to this Hobbesian jungle. And it seems to me that a similar space exists. And these are the dialogue points, I guess, we've been touching on throughout our conversation today. But it seems to me that the Chinese tradition also has these openings. You know, you talked about the ways of thinking about how humans flourish in the social context, in the context of family and social relationships, and performing roles and having duties and obligations, etc., etc. And all of that goes towards mitigating the conditions that make fear possible. And perhaps one of the starting points of a rich East West dialogue, perhaps even with our Hungarian friends in China, could be around this question of what is it that we think makes a good life, and how does that manifest in the way that we understand the relationships between people fundamentally, and by extension of that, the relationship between groups of people with one another.
brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You see, this
Well,
idea,
this is
no,
this is just riffing, right?
no, this
I'm
is
just thinking.
precisely it. If we, who would have thought, who'd have thunk, right, that a notion of the good life, what we think of the good life, a substantive notion of the good life, could have anything to do with international relations, for example. Because in the liberal framework, there is none. Because there is no conception of the good life. There is only individual preferences. There is no common good. There is only the aggregation of individual utilities, individual conceptions of good life, right? Which are a matter of taste, which are a matter of maximization of whatever it is that you want. Okay, your choice set, maximizing your budget set, or whatever it is. But it's basically an economistic conception of the human being, and a substantive notion of the good life would include, whether in the Eastern or in the Western tradition, a notion of a common good that is more than just the individual satisfaction or the individual goods. There is something called a society and a family that can flourish. Similarly, there'll be a notion of peace, and this is very strong in the Chinese tradition, as being more than the mere cessation of war. You know, in the Hobbesian liberal view, there really is no such thing as peace as a substantive thing. It is, or peace is merely the absence of war.
It's that moment in between the fighting.
Moment in between fighting, but it's just, in the Hobbesian view, right? How do you, the Hobbesian solution to the war of all against all is to have one big gangster on top of that, which, the Leviathan,
Yeah.
who then has a monopoly of violence, right? And this is your government. But the fundamental elements of that ontology are, are these these agents and violence and coercion. So the other guys, you have quote unquote peace, but that's because you're terrified of a bigger violence. So it's violence versus violence, right? There is
Yeah.
no peace as a sort of flourishing, as a thing good in itself, as something that grows, as something that has, if I may say, a certain beauty and a joy in it. Because in Chinese
Mm.
tradition, if you anything, and just in the way ordinary people speak and experience peace, or write about peace, or how the poets have written about peace, since for all our recorded history, is something to be enjoyed. It's something that has a life of its own, and it's an end to be achieved. It's not merely the cessation of war.
Yeah, that's fascinating, John, actually, because what you're describing is this sense that peace is something that's actually full. It's full of stuff,
It's full.
as opposed
Yeah,
it's as opposed to it being empty of
yeah.
war.
And it wants to reach
Right.
out. It's not sufficient to itself. It won't stay with the individual or with the family. It goes, it reaches outward to the state and then to the world. The 大同. This is the
Mm.
Confucian notion of the great harmony. And you know what? Yeah, you can be cynical about it, but even Chinese projects such as the Belt and Road, I'm not saying that they were thinking of this necessarily, but behind that in the cultural memory is an understanding that peace is not something sufficient to it. It will not, it is not to be contained, that it must be shared, that you cannot have peace with your neighbor being indigent, for example, right? And that they have no security without common security. This is geopolitically significant. You look at what Europe is trying to do is to have a security without any regard for Russian security, let us say,
Well, the
or
irony, it
Iranian
seems to me,
security.
in the European frame,
Yeah.
is that in fact security is being pursued by ensuring neither side has any sense of security at all, and because in a sense the pursuit of arming up
Yeah.
only takes place in an environment of fear, and an environment of fear, by definition, cannot be an environment in which one feels a sense of security. Right?
Yes.
So the
Yes.
absence of security is actually the condition precedent of the pursuit of
Yes.
a particular form of security architecture,
Yeah.
which actually reinforces the absence of security.
Yeah.
Look, uh, it was an amazing 3 days. Look, I thought, look, I mean, it's been the first time I've been to Hungary for 19 years, and uh, uh, the chance to just sit and observe, really, firstly the interactions of Hungarians together with our Western European friends was something that I thought was fascinating. But this philosophical effort, which of course translates into some politics and some public policy initiatives, seems to open up a lot of vistas for cross civilizational dialogue, and perhaps this is something that creates for us all a glimmer of hope that that we don't need to necessarily succumb to the Hobbesian framing, and that through the application of human ingenuity, creativity, and effort, we can carve out ways in which we can create the conditions for a full and rich good life for all. John, thanks very much for coming on and sharing your perspectives and experiences, not only of the conference, but also more broadly, your take on some of the big issues, including the ones that realism brings to the table. I'd love to sort of dive deeper into this on another occasion, and perhaps we should rope some of our newfound Hungarian friends into a
Yes.
conversation.
Yes.
But look, perhaps we'll draw a line here at this moment. It's a convenient finishing point. Thanks again for sharing your time, your wisdom, and your insights, and hope to catch up with you again soon.
Thank you.
If you liked that video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.